Me okay and see the presentation?
Good.
Yep. All right. So for the next 20 minutes, I'll cover farm visit biosecurity. So what is farm visit biosecurity? So it's taking steps to reduce the risk of introducing and transferring plant pests within and between farm operations. And just so you know, there's no such thing as zero risk. You try your best to minimize it, but you can't guarantee that there is no risk. And so just how can pests spread? So there are natural means that you can't really do anything about. So certain pests can travel by wind. So spores from soybean rust is one example. Also insects can travel in the wind, and they can also fly. So flight is another means. Pests can also spread by human activity, so in international trade. So we can have, it can be done by plants and plant parts and seeds, grain. You can bring in pests that way. Also, some pests are excellent hitchhikers. So in the bottom picture here, there's 2 red circles around brown marmorated stink bug that came in on a shipment of PVC piping from an infested state. Another way that pests can move is on contaminated stuff. So such as vehicles, footwear, hair, equipment, clothing, and hands. So as a scout, these are the things that you should really be thinking about. You want to be able to protect your clients. You don't want to be a vector for a new pest being introduced to their farm. And I like to show this study because I think it's really interesting. It was done by McNeil a few years back. And what they did was they surveyed organisms present in the soil that had been removed from footwear being carried in the baggage of international aircraft passengers that were arriving in New Zealand. And what they found is that they recorded high incidence counts and diversity of viable, so live bacteria, fungi, nematodes, and seeds, as well as several live arthropods. And in each gram of soil, there was an estimated 52 to 84% incident of genre that contains species regulated by New Zealand's National Plant Protection Organization. So that's a bit scary and surprising. So just to go along the footwear theme, so back in 2015, O'Malford did a little soil biosecurity project. So we had the objective of this project was to determine the risk of footwear to obtain soil-borne pathogens, and we were specifically looking at nematodes and fungal pathogens when walking around in fields of 2 different soil types and under dry and wet soil conditions. And so we had 4 people walk around the field with clean rubber boots for 20 minutes, and we did the same fields under dry and under wet conditions. So we looked at a silt loam and a sandy loam, I think it was. And so we did collect the soil from each pair of boots using a hoof pick. And we also did take a background sample. So using a soil probe, we went about 8 inches down just to ensure what exactly was there. And so it was a good comparison to the soil that we collected from the boots. And so we sent all these samples in to the University of Guelph, the Pest Diagnostic Clinic, and we had a DNA multi-scan run to look for fungal pathogens, and also they did nematode extractions. So what we found was there was a whole bunch of stuff that we found. A lot of this is common, like endemic pests, like Rhizoctonia silene is pretty common. The one field we knew there was a history of Sugarbeet Cis nematode, and also they have Plasmodiphora brassica, so that plant pathogen that causes clubroot. And those aren't found in every field. So that's why we did target that field, because we were interested to see if we could pick up those things. So what we found was the risk of transferring soil-borne pathogens on footwear was similar when walking around silt loam and loamy sand fields. And we did collect more soil and more soil-borne pathogens on footwear after walking around fields under wet conditions, which isn't totally surprising. For Sugarbeet Cis nematode Cis, we did detect on 1 person's footwear after walking around the silt loam fields under wet conditions. Also, root lesion nematodes were not detected on any footwears, footwear after walking around a loamy sand field, regardless of the soil conditions. And for the Plasmodiphora brassica, the causal agent in clubroot and brassica crops, it was only detected in the silt loam field, but silt loam soil, but we knew that field had a history of that. And the DNA of the brassica was detected on most footwear after walking around the field during both wet and dry conditions. And so in the picture, you can see like sometimes we weren't getting a lot of soil on the boots. So it was a bit surprising. But just because we were picking up the DNA of these pathogens doesn't mean that it was viable. So we would have had to do a further study to prove that. But really what we wanted to do was demonstrate that there is some risk of transferring pathogens and nematodes on dirty boots. And Katie mentioned soybean cis nematode earlier today. So this nematode can infect soybeans and can cause stunting and yellowing of the leaves. And it's frequently found in circular patterns in the field, and it can move in soil. So it was first detected in Ontario in 1988. And since then, it is now found in most counties west of Toronto and is now found in certain parts of Eastern Ontario. So this disease can be managed effectively, but the first step is really identification and awareness. And so I did include a Farm Visit Biosecurity handout for you. So please refer to the revised one that I sent out this morning, because it's more tailored to scouts. The other one was more for our crop specialists, like when we're called out to diagnose the problem. So this one's a little more appropriate for you. And so this is a summary of the main points from our OMAFRA Farm Visit Biosecurity Protocol for visiting orchards, vineyards, crop fields, and greenhouses. And it shows the practices that you can do to help minimize, rather than eliminate the risk of disease, insect nematodes, or weed transmission under normal circumstances. And so there is additional biosecurity measures that may be required in situations where there may be a contagious plant disease or a regulated crop pest. So you might need to wear washable or disposable footwear and clothing. And but discussing concerns you may have with your advisor where farm visit biosecurity requirements may conflict with your safety. And so I'm thinking here, like if it's really hot out and wearing coveralls and that type of situation, you don't want to have heat exhaustion. So those types of things. And sometimes the plastic disposable booties can be pretty slippery. So depending on what the situation, that might be a concern as well. So I've just shown you a picture of what is in my biosecurity kit. So I do tend to carry a few pairs of rubber boots. I don't always have a chance, like if I'm trying to jam a lot in one day, to clean them after each farm. So I'll stick it in a plastic bag and clean it when I have time. I do also carry disposable booties, like the blue plastic ones, also the little hospital booties. So those I wear more for if I'm changing traps in the same farm and I want to try and keep down any soil down getting into the car when I'm hopping in and out. So I'll put those on and then I can take them off before I get it back in and throw them in a baggie. I also use disposable gloves a lot. They're good to have if you're handling pheromone lures as well. Disinfectant wipes, always using them. Lots of bags, paper towels to wipe down equipment, too. Kitty litter box that I use to clean my boots in, and so I always carry potable water as well, and some detergent. The hoof pick to remove that soil before I do any cleaning, and also some disinfectants. So there are some brands of rubbing alcohol that are ethanol based, so I'll use those. There's also Burcon as well in tablet or powder that you can use. Some people use bleach. So it depends your circumstance and if you know the history of the field, what you're trying to protect from, and because disinfectants can be effective against different things. So before the visit, if possible, call ahead to the grower. And this is gives you a chance to see if there's any additional biosecurity measures in place on the farm. So in the case of like all of a sudden they are aware of a contagious plant disease or a regulated pest, you can have the heads up on that. And also, just with the COVID situation right now, it gives you a chance to confirm that you can maintain that physical distancing, and to see if there's anyone sick on the farm. So yeah, just follow precautions for the current COVID situation. It's best to schedule farm visits when to avoid walking in wet fields and touching wet plants as much as possible. Also, clean and disinfect any equipment that you're going to be using on the plants, and wear clean clothes and footwear. And upon arrival, it's best to drive slowly to avoid unnecessary contamination of the vehicle. Like, you don't want to be zooming down the lane and then the dust is flying all over the place. Also, you want to roll up the windows. Yeah, this past year we had a gypsy moth infestation, so they were always trying to get in the vehicle. So it's always good to roll up your windows. Park in a designated visitor parking and or away from barns and other sources of contamination. So you don't want to park near air intake vents or ventilation and exhaust. Clean your hands with disinfectant hand gels. Ask to sign the visitor logbook. I don't know if things have changed with the COVID situation. That maybe the grower will have other practices in place, so maybe they'll want you to text instead, like when you're arriving. So it's best to check with your supervisor and the grower. And put on protective footwear and clothing before entering a field, orchard, vineyard, or greenhouse in high-risk situations. So again, like if there's a contagious plant disease or regulated pest present. And wear protective footwear and clothing if unable to assess whether a situation's high risk. So your advisor can probably help you out with that, and also the grower. So during the visit, if possible, leave the vehicle in a designated area and walk the crops. So the whole thing is you're trying to limit the exposure of your stuff to what's on that farm, but you can't always do that. So sometimes I'll have traps way at the back of the farm, and I have a lot of equipment to carry, and it's just not feasible that I'm going to carry all that. So just try and limit the driving through the fields as much as you possibly can, and drive slow. Obtain all signage and barriers, so you don't want to enter buildings unless permitted by the farm operator. And again, just follow any precautions for the current COVID situation. Also avoid unnecessary contact with the crop. So like certain diseases such as tobacco mosaic virus can easily spread by contact to other susceptible hosts. And wash and disinfect any equipment that will be used on plants between use on what we call biologically separate or unique areas and or buildings within the premise. And before leaving the operation, visually inspect your clothing, your hair, your equipment to ensure there's no insects or plant material present or attached. Ensure your footwear is free of excess soil and plant debris. Use a brush to remove that soil from the tread, and wash and disinfect your footwear. Wash and disinfect any equipment used during the visit, and wash hands or clean your hands with disinfectant hand gel. And cleaning your footwear. So as I mentioned, remove the debris and soil. You need to do that first because organic matter will bind to the disinfectant and it'll make it ineffective. So you're just wasting your time there. So it's really important to clean off that organic matter, rinse your footwear, dissolve its disinfectant and submerge it in your boots in that. So certain products do have an exposure time on the label. So for like Virkon, I believe it's like a 10-minute exposure. So make sure that you're following that. Sometimes people will spray their boots instead because they don't have time to soak it, so they spray it down really well. And before leaving the operation, leave disposable materials with the grower if you can. Another option is to put the stuff in a sealed plastic bag or washable sealable container so you can dispose of it later. And try and really keep clean and dirty material separate. And inspect the interior and exterior of your vehicle for any visible contamination. And that can be manure, insects, plant material, excess soil. And remove as much visible contamination as possible before leaving the operation. Contaminated vehicles must be washed. Well, this is our protocol before entering another agricultural operation. There are some additional measures if there is a contagious disease or a suspect new pest. So if you're taking a sample, place it in a container that's sealed properly so that you won't have anything get out. Visit the site with the known or suspected contagious or regulated plant pest last, if you're doing more than one visit during that day. And boots and field equipment must be cleaned with a disinfectant agent before leaving that site. If this contagious disease or regulated pest is soil-borne, and wash the vehicle before entering another farm or facility. So the greenhouse growers, they're pretty strict with their biosecurity, and the Ontario Greenhouse Veg Growers and OMAFRA developed this postcard that growers can give to their visitors when they're coming to their facility. So it pretty much outlines a lot of the similar things that I just mentioned. And I already went over some of the stuff on things that you can carry. So these are the same type of things that I carry in my biosecurity kit. And I mentioned a few times during this presentation about regulated pests. So just so you're aware, the federal government does have an agency called the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, so the CFIA. And they have a plant protection program in place to help prevent the introduction and spread within Canada of plant pests of quarantine significance. So they have a list of regulated pests that they will take action on. And the actions that they take really depends on the pest. So, but it can mean that the crop needs, like it could mean that the crop needs to be destroyed if a regulated pest is found. It really depends. But I just want you to be aware that there is a responsibility to report new pests. You're supposed to report that to CFIA, but first you should check with your supervisor that it is actually a new pest. These situations can be very contentious and should be handled by your supervisor. So you should immediately inform your supervisor if you do suspect a new pest. And just showing an example of why it's important to check with your supervisor or someone that may have more experience than you, because some of you may be very new to scouting. So the big picture here is Asian longhorn beetle, and that is a regulated pest by the CFIA. And there are some lookalikes. So we do also have the white spotted Sawyer beetle down in the left corner, and that's present in Ontario and sometimes confused with Asian longhorn beetle. Also, some people do confuse it with the Western conifer seed bug. So that's why it's really important to make sure that you have the proper identification. And that's it for me. So is there any questions?